This is the next to the last of our series on the Gnosis in art and literature, which we have been holding all of last month and a couple of Fridays this time, and in which respect it was my intention to call attention to the artistic and literary wellsprings of the culture over a period of time, and so we considered the subject of theater, we considered the subject of poetry, the various genres of the verbal arts, and then I thought that we'll demonstrate some of that by speaking of some of the great literary figures who have contributed very powerfully to the formation of various aspects of our culture, and that is how beginning last Friday we have started on that, and so today we shall address ourselves to a really extremely important figure of the literary scene of the 20th century, and maybe even a tiny bit of the 19th before, namely that of D.H. Lawrence. It may appear more relevant in a few minutes' time, but I intend to mention right at the beginning a classification of what has been called Platonic madness, or the altered state of consciousness of those who are connected with some artistic inspiration, and this classification was made by Marsilio Ficino at the time of the Renaissance, who of course was the great translator hired by the Medici family, who translated from our point of view the extremely interesting Corpus Hermeticum, the Hermetic books, which his Medici patron thought so highly of that he told Ficino to translate those books before he translated Plato. So that's really quite a compliment. In any event, Ficino spoke of 4 kinds of Platonic madness, as he called them, which appertain to the poet, the priest, the prophet, and the lover. It's a very nice sort of Renaissance classification. And which really correspond to a certain extent with what certainly in our days, particularly by way of our greatly respected C.G. Jung, have been defined as the 4 functions of consciousness, such as thinking, feeling, sensation, and intuition. That would be that the intuition would be the function of the poet. The sensation is the function of the ritualist, such as the priest, the thinking of the prophet, and the feeling of the lover. So this may or may not be pertinent to our subject, but I thought it was an interesting prefiguration of psycho-spiritual discoveries of a later time. Now this evening we are devoted to David Herbert Lawrence, usually referred to as D.H. Lawrence, who was a practitioner of what the poet with a deep, almost all-consuming appreciation and interest is that of the lover. So it was a combination, we might say, of the intuitive and of the feeling orientation of consciousness, which are, of course, sort of on a common axis. They have a connection with each other. Now, D.H. Lawrence was historically a man of the turn of the century. When people refer to the turn of the century, they usually meant the turn from the 19th to the 20th century. The turn from the 20th to the 21st has not been long enough yet to attribute a particular characteristics to it. But that is really what we are talking about. He was born in 1885, and by the early part of the, I think he died in 1930, he was gone. So he was of a generation which has some particular feeling tone meaning to me, because my father was of the turn of the century people. He lived his youth, his best years, all of his involvement with the thoroughbred horses of England and so forth, all before the turn of the century. And so let's say I had somebody whom I was able to study through much of my life in that particular light. But let's say, in essence, D.H. Lawrence was really a prophetic figure whose insightful vision extended over a timeless range of many ages and centuries, and whose message has, I think, really lost little of its relevance today, even though perhaps the interest in his works and through that in his message certainly does not equal the interest of some years ago. So his literary output was not only impressive but colossal. The man must have been an extremely hard worker with his writing, for he wrote steadily from about 1905 onwards until his death, and his first book, which I really liked the title of The White Peacock, being published in 1911. Even more impressive is the number of works of literary criticism and evaluation and really philosophy which he had put forth and which have been written not so much by him but about him. This is a writer who arrested the attention of a lot of other writers who all wrote about him. By 1968, more than 800 volumes of books and pamphlets have been published concerning Lawrence. And Lawrence Durrell, whom we spoke about, another Lawrence, whom we spoke about a week ago, has rightly stated that today D.H. Lawrence has appeared as has begun to seem more of an academic industry than a writer. That was Lawrence Durrell's saying. Now the question arises, why? He was a prolific writer, but there were others who wrote more. He was a master of style, and so were others. He wrote of exciting and often unconventional subjects but so did others, especially during the time that elapsed between his death and our own days. So why did he receive all that attention? Obviously it's not does not prevail to that extent today, but there certainly was a great deal of attention showered on him. So many answers have been suggested, but only a few appear to ring true, and I shall begin with one of these. In 1932, a mere 2 years after the death of Lawrence, and about one or 2 years after my own birth, if I may be so arrogant about it, after the death of Lawrence, a young girl in Paris, who was not a Parisian by birth, published a book about him. And the girl was somebody whom we hope to deal with to some extent next week, namely Anais Nin, a true phenomenon of our age in her own right, an astonishing combination of talent, of bohemianism, of humor, and of philosophical depth. At least I have found her that. You know, she, if it doesn't ring a bell right away to you, you may think back to the 1960s and the early 1970s when her diaries were published. That's what really put her on the map here. And there was quite a big Anais Nin period. I will always be grateful to her, not only for very entertaining material in her diaries, but for something that is sort of not absolutely directly connected with her, because I knew that she and her husband were very friendly with Lawrence Durrell. So I conceived of an idea at a certain point, that was already after the death of Anais Nin, that I wanted to contact Lawrence Durrell and send him a copy of my book, which was really my chef-d'oeuvre, if you can call it that, namely the Gnostic humor. I says, how am I going to reach that guy? I knew he was somewhere in France, and France is a big country, and so I said, he was a big friend of Anais Nin and of her husband. So I looked. In those days you still could find something interesting in the Los Angeles Times, which in my opinion is no longer the case. But let's say I was looking around in the paper, here was a lecture scheduled by Anais Nin's widowed husband, right near my favorite restaurant, Takes restaurant on Sunset and Alvarado, in the basement of a Baptist church. Well, I don't care, Baptist church or anything else. So I wrote a letter and I contacted Anais Nin's husband and asked him whether it would be possible for me to bring my book there, and could he possibly forward it to Lawrence Durrell. He said, oh yes, of course. And that was the beginning of a nice little contact with Lawrence Durrell, and where I learned, as I mentioned last week, about his interest in Gnosticism, about his close friendship with some of the people in France, such as Jacques Lacarrière, who wrote one of the early, very fine, very poetic, because he is a poet, books on Gnosticism and so forth. And then I had a very nice letter from Lawrence Durrell in in response. So there is Anais Nin, who was the first one to call attention to D.H. Lawrence. Anais Nin, who was a true phenomenon of our age, really, in her own right, as I said before, and that small but exquisite work that she wrote about D.H. Lawrence was entitled D.H. Lawrence, an Unprofessional Study. Anais Nin wrote her work about Lawrence, and in it, in the early paragraph, she wrote as follows: there must be a threefold desire of intellect, of imagination, and of physical feeling, because he erected his world on a fusion of concepts, on a philosophy that was against division, on a plea for whole vision, to see with the soul and the body. And I would say that with her perspicacious intellect, Anais Nin put her finger that early on a very important quality of the work of D.H. Lawrence, which is that Lawrence was striving for a vision of life, and consequently its expression in art and in literature, which was whole, which wasn't just of one particular aspect, not just scholarship, not just abstract philosophy, not just wild romance, but somehow an integrated wholeness which he felt was a desirable condition of the human mind, of the human soul. So he adhered to a philosophy that was against division. His work was a plea for whole vision, and this seems to me to be of very great importance, and that should work into our evaluation, our judgment of his work, because that, let's say, that striving, that desire of the mind is a very, very important one. But we are getting ahead of ourselves a little bit. Lawrence's work divides itself into several main periods, which is usual with writers, each characterized by certain keynotes. Between 1909 and 1913, as quite a young man, he wrote primarily poetry, in the genre and in the nature of love poems. While there were not great poems as far as poetry goes, when judged by not great poems when judged by the standards of English poetry, they began to show something that Lawrence called his demon. Now that will take some explaining. Horace Gregory, one of his major insightful critics, referred to that and explained the issue of the demon. Now, we, in our colloquial conversations, we tend to use the term demon sort of synonymous with devil. But that's really rather incorrect. It comes from the Greek daimonion, which was a concept of the ancient Greeks that is not that easy to apprehend, but I think is of great profundity. For instance, some of the great philosophers were known in Greece as he had a daimonion, and which really means some kind of a spiritual nature, an additional or another personality, which was very, very important. So I think that is an important issue to consider. Now, obviously, we are dealing here with a person who lived quite a long time ago, and it kind of pretty soon much of it will run a century ago. But who, let's say, when we look at his, once again, his intentionality, his striving with sufficient amount of force, then we find that his demon that he referred to is an aspect of self, a kind of consciousness within the individual which represents a higher authority. That is the daimonion, like there is a spirit associated with a person's thinking, and this, when we are looking for analogues of that notion, of that concept, of that reality in more recent times, I think, of course that is my orientation anyway, the analog that I find is the most closely related to this is the concept of self with a capital S that C.G. Jung was referring to, and which finds its manifestations, after all, if this is a valid and important, shall we say, principle of the human psyche, then it did not come into existence at the time of C.G. Jung, but was there all along. And that being the case, a deeper, a higher, a more all-encompassing and more profound and ultimately more transcendental selfhood of the human being. So much so that the ancient Greeks would say, well, whoever it might be, Pythagoras, Plato himself, Socrates was, I think, primarily known for, they always refer to him with his daimonion. So an aspect of a person's consciousness which is extraordinary, and which therefore is capable of inspiring, of informing, of transforming an individual. And C.G. Jung in his psychology has pinpointed something of a very similar nature in the self with a capital S, which he felt was the central archetype of the psyche. So I think Jung even referred to it at times that it, in terms of the ancient nomenclature of the Greeks and things of that sort, it was like a god, a deity associated with a particular person, and so that seemed to have been a very important element in Lawrence's own psyche, So in most people, this intentionality, let's say, probably in all of us, has a personal message. That its main message is become whole, which of course is in the individuation process that Jung pointed out. The daimonion, the demon, therefore consists to a major extent of a unifying intentionality and also, let's say, the union of the opposites. Mercury, Hermes, the unifier, Thoth, and ultimately I would say when we look at the so-called Gnostic Bibles, Gnostic scriptures like the Gospel of Thomas and the Gospel of Philip, I think we find that kind of unifying intentionality in the sayings that are attributed to Jesus. So from ancient Egypt, wherein, as at least one teacher of mine used to call it, the Egyptians held out the prospect of ossification. Now, this is not ossification, which is becoming a bone. There are enough boneheads in the world, I think, already, you know. But it's becoming Osiris, going through the death and the resurrection of the greater self. So from ossirification to alchemy, it is always the keynote of union. And it would seem that from the very beginning of his literary career, D.H. Lawrence was very, very intent upon the importance of such a union and upon the possibility of accomplishing that. And of course, being an artist, being a writer, he worked for its accomplishment in his writings. This, of course, brings us to what might be considered the chief theme of Lawrence's work, which was, as he himself said at times, which was dictated to him by his demon, as it were, and which he specified as a union of feeling, of thinking, and of physicality, which of necessity led him into a unique treatment of many human activities, and perhaps the one because of some of his later works he became very much famous for or associated with: sexuality, love, including physical love, which hit the culture of the early 20th century largely in his writings, like a bombshell, and gave Lawrence the reputation of an author who, in the words of the 1929 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, and I quote, was increasingly obsessed by the problem of sex, especially in his later works. Well, I think that's an unjust and judgmental statement, but let us say he was very interested, of course, in that, and I think that from his point of view, for a good reason. So between 1911 and 1915, he wrote 4 major works. The White Peacock, which I mentioned already, which I love that title, and it's been a long time that I read it, because I love peacocks, especially white ones. I mean, a white peacock is a marvel. A good friend of ours in Texas, whom we have just visited, has, how many white peacocks does it have now? About two fully grown white peacocks. And they're astonishing creatures. They're like a vision. In any event, the white peacock, the these are all individual titles of books. The Trespasser, Sons and Lovers, and the Rainbow. And the last of these, published in 1915, The Rainbow, already earned him some difficulty. It earned him some police prosecution for the sexual themes. So you see, in every historical period, the quote, authorities, the governments, whether local or national, find something whereby to beat up on us. Well, they found that to beat up on poor old Lawrence. So his sexual themes were considered reprehensible. So Lawrence began to see that his demon was leading him to the full recognition that in the area of sexuality lay perhaps the greatest obstacles of human wholeness, greatest conflict, and also the greatest promise of the ultimate reconciliation of the opposites. Well, dear, I don't find it imperative to go into a lot of detail, but if you look at very, symbolism of very spiritual processes, especially those that involve the interaction and ultimately the union of the opposites, such as alchemy, the conjunctio, the coming together, the conjoining of the opposites, in alchemy represented in various ways. If you prefer humanoid figures, then the king and the queen. If you prefer celestial figures, then the sun and the moon. If you prefer metals and minerals and things of that sort, then the salt and the sulfur. But let's say the opposites coming together. And certainly, let's say, a very likely manifestation that an ever-present and ever-important symbol of that is sexuality. No doubt also a subject and a pursuit that has its difficulties, as we all know, and is the cause of a great deal of trouble, but at the same time, let's say, carries that symbolic meaning that the plus and the minus, the male and the female, the opposites, the salt and the sulfur, have to get together. And when they get together, the ultimate result is something important, something valuable, something that will enrich the life of the individual, or I don't know, perhaps even of the cosmos, although that is a little more difficult to deal with. So I think that he discerned that what is happening here, and of the activity, let's say, the drive, the instinct, which is most closely related symbolically with the conjunction of the opposites is sexuality, both in its physical and its emotional and whatever other psychological aspects there may be involved. Lawrence began to see that his demon was leading him to this kind of recognition, and that this was important. All along he became aware of the fact he became aware of the noted fact of psychological projection, recognizing that everything he perceived outside of himself was truly also inside of his being, his own soul. And he, the man was such a prolific writer that if I had decided to use a number of his quotations, then we would be here all night. And in all likelihood that might be a little bit too much for us. So let's say I am alluding to some of his works which you may find fairly easily in the literature. In his poem, which is entitled New Heaven and Earth, which is of course a biblical statement, he gives utterance to this in a very moving way. All along there is, you can see that what he is seeking is not just sexual pleasure, but that what he is seeking is wholeness, which artistically must be conjoined with the artist's willingness to portray the whole truth as he recognizes it. So let's say his position was that if you are, well, in this case, poet, writer, other kind of artist, if you don't put yourself out there to represent as much wholeness from within yourself as you can muster, then you are really betraying your artistic and your poetic vocation. So the artist should not cut down on his or her striving for the expression of wholeness, because that is really the purpose of the artist. And by doing that, the artist will then engender the striving for wholeness and the arising of wholeness in others. I think there is no doubt about it. I don't know whether you have encountered or you are conscious of having encountered people who are really quite whole, very, very united, very much the individuum, the indivisible wholeness. If you encounter that in people, it really makes an impression, and you will admire and perhaps strive for that condition yourself. Because at least speaking for myself, I think what bothers us about people, well, many things bother us about people, for God's sakes. We would have to enumerate millions of things. But one thing is that there is so much one-sidedness in the human character. So you encounter somebody whom you can relate to really quite well in some particular area, but as soon as you move in your interaction from that area, then you are worlds apart. You can't. There is no coming together. And from the time that I became acquainted with Jung, and of course I had seen the pictures before, long before I went to Rome and saw them myself, but you know, the finger of the Creator, God, and Adam touching, what is it? Wholeness. The greatness and the Creator and creation, the ultimate and the temporal coming together. And that is a very, very important thing, that is really sort of very much, at least the symbolic manifestation of the purpose of human life. He stated this in many of his works, one of them in his book Women in Love, but as I said, I was not going to use quotations much today. So the whole truth of a state, whatever you may feel about it, in other words, try to recognize the whole truth about what you are dealing with, what you are observing, and not just one thing. Now, you know, if we could really do that, can you imagine what would happen to all these areas of strife and conflict and misery that we are about? Because you would see the other side. So when people are yelling and screaming at each other over politics, if they could say, oh yeah, but on the other hand, once again that can be overdone. You can become just a wimp when you see all sides of an issue. But but it's also important to see a little bit of the opposite of what you have perceived. And that is really a move toward wholeness. So now we come a little closer to one of the subjects that we sometimes get into here, especially in connection with Jung, but which we must recognize was a matter of growing and very powerful public interest throughout the 20th century, and therefore obviously also was of great interest to D.H. Lawrence. And what was that? Psychology. You know, depth psychology, or psychoanalysis as he named it, of Sigmund Freud, was born right at the turn of the century, because his principal book, he himself regarded it as his masterwork of Sigmund Freud, was his book on the interpretation of dreams. You know, Freud himself had a fantasy, never came to pass. And I'm not a Freudian, but I for my living at one time, for about 2.5 years, I had to study Freud constantly, you know, because I was a literary researcher or writer who was writing about Freud, and I furnished him the material. But anyway, I become much more friendly to the old boy. First of all, nobody who likes cigars that much can be all bad. I mean, that's my own tobaccoist judgment. But that's of course is supposed to be a joke, although not funny. But let's say, you know, Freud was definitely not a bad man. He was a great pioneer, and when C.G. Jung wrote Freud's upon Freud's death, the tribute to Freud, he said that Freud was a colossal pioneer. And he was. and extremely courageous and very intent upon doing what he felt he had to do. But let's see, he also was a man of very rigid thinking. So he had his own dogmas, and he wouldn't let go of them. He isn't the only one in history, but he certainly was. And so, of course, one of the psychological facts that Freud came up with was repression. What does repression mean? Well, literally it means pushing down. I have once, I don't know whether that was such a good definition or not, but I defined the psychological repression as forgetting with a vengeance. Which means it's, when you forget, but when you forget, sort of like the mafia when they kill people and throw them in the East River or so, they don't just throw them in, but they tie a great big heavy rock or something, weight around them so it'll go down and won't come up. Well, it's that kind of a psychological maneuver, and that is why there are things. I mean, that was, of course, Freud's one of his big discoveries. So, forgetting with a vengeance. Now, psychological repression, and there are other repressions, of course, too. Say there is cultural repression, there is political repression, and they are always related. Jung made a statement to his friend and disciple Barbara Hanna, who really wrote one of the nicest biographies of Jung, and he said to her that the following things, the following concepts and precepts and so forth, were the ones that have been repressed in our culture. Number 1, nature. Number 2, animals. Number 3, sexuality. And number 4, and perhaps most importantly, the creative imagination. You wouldn't expect Jung to be that outspoken on these matters, but he certainly was. So eventually, let's say, after human has sort of created his own space, which is of which I think much of the old American homesteading, the old American West, the travel westward in the covered wagons and then going out into the middle of nowhere and building a house and raising animals, and so a sort of I think an important symbolic manifestation that in order to survive in this world, you have to practice some repression. Otherwise it's not going to work. The pioneer had to suppress nature, at least right over there where he had his house and he had growing his crops, otherwise he would have died. But on the other hand, as always, we are extremists. We do certain things because perhaps we must or we should, but then we overdo them and we won't let go of them. This is part of our nature. We can't get away from it, but it sure would be nice if we could get away from it sometimes. So let's say eventually, however, after the log cabin is built, after the crops are cultivated, some balance must be restored, lest alienation from nature and physical and psychological damage to the human will occur. Now, those who know me will know that I'm not a nature boy. I don't get turned on by the natural world too much. Oh yeah. I prefer, let's say, a garden laid out like Versailles to a wilderness. Why? Because it's what in French we call c'est soigné. It's nicely cultivated. It has aesthetic value to me. The aesthetic value of raw nature is something else again. So let's say I don't belong to the little green people and all that sort of thing, but one has to recognize certain things if one is going to be honest about them. So eventually some balance must be restored, lest alienation from nature and physical and psychological damage to the human occur. And I said that before. Now, again, all as Goethe says so beautifully in the last stanza of the second part of Faust, all things transitory, but as Symbols are meant. Alles Vergängliche ist nur ein Gleichnis. So there is a symbol. There is a symbolic importance involved here also, because the let's say nature is symbolic, among other things, of what? Of the unconscious in us. It's like a wilderness. If you delve into your unconscious, God heavens, you don't know what the heck you're going to find there. So all psychoanalysts and others have found. It's a strange, mysterious region. And in it are maybe some really nice, interesting things, but there are also sort of the equivalent of rattlesnakes and scorpions. So it's the unconscious. Civilization, on the other hand, is the symbol of consciousness. Why? Because it's consciousness that creates civilization. Which is probably one of the reasons that, while I certainly was never involved in that field professionally, that I'm a great lover of architecture, especially not a crummy modern architecture that is now taking the place of old Hollywood or so forth. I could dynamite the stuff that they're building, But let's say really beautiful architecture, and why it is the product of human consciousness. It is the product of human skill, and combined with the human desire for beauty. Those are all results of consciousness. It's only conscious people admire the beautiful. Only conscious people have a striving for that and want to live within that. So when civilization fights nature, what it is doing is it wants to become itself. And then civilization recognizes that to some extent it needs nature, it needs the natural environment. So come various concerns, conservation, ecology, whatnot, and the same is with the repression of animals. First, like the pioneer, too many animals around, kills them off. If he didn't kill off the wild boar and things like that, he wouldn't have a crop. You have to defend what you are doing, and you have to defend it against animal nature. There's no doubt about it. But let's say first we kill the animals off, then now we are in the asphalt jungle in our cities, and what do we do then? We begin to cultivate pets. You have probably no idea, unless you are neighbors here, as to the incredible number of pets, particularly dogs, that inhabit Beechwood Canyon. I think they outnumber humans vastly. And once again, I look forward to justifying that contention, because this Sunday is the eve of the feast of St. Francis, and we have a custom whereby we bless the animals for St. Francis the last, and we do that out in front of the door. My fellow priest and I, we alternate. Last year, in about 2 hours' time, we blessed 28 dogs. And I think there'll be more than that this Sunday, you know. So now we strive for the animal, and of course there are good psychological reasons for that too, and also. Repression originally may be useful, but ultimately it must diminish and, if possible, cease. Repression is on all different levels, at the individual level, which of course is the one that is then projected, or in public life on the political level and whatever. Repression is based in fear. That if we don't repress what we are repressing, the about to be repressed commodity will in some way get us. That's what we are afraid of, and actually not without reason. But ultimately, we have to come to an arrangement. It even says in Scripture, and the slaves will be free and the captives delivered, which again also can be interpreted symbolically, that what is repressed has to come forth. So, and one kind of repression often needs the other, calls to the other. For instance, repressive dictatorships, not only politically and economically are repressive, but let's say also sexually, artistically, intellectually, and spiritually. You know, I don't want to go into too much in this, but for instance, when just before the 1920s, the Russian Revolution broke out, and the Bolsheviks took over and everything. And there were a lot of sort of idealistic intellectuals in Russia, because old Russia had a very active academic life. they turned out intellectuals like crazy. In any event, you know, they always say, oh, well, these people with the red flags and everything, they, you know, they are for freedom. So we are going to be free to do anything we want to do. We're going to be free to go to bed with the neighbor's wife and daughter, maybe both of them at the same time, you know, whatever, all kinds of things, you know. And you know what, the Bolsheviks, when they took over with Lenin and so, became more repressive, especially in sexual terms, than anybody has been before, you know. And so there was great big disappointment that the freedoms that were promised extended to such a very small area of life. And that's something to keep in mind, you know. Lawrence thus became more and more imbued with the need to struggle against repression. And here he was synchronistically, or perhaps consciously, picking up on a theme that the little doctor with his cigar in Vienna was talking about, namely Sigmund Freud. So Lawrence saw repression in cultural terms, because it comes from the psychological nature of the human. And Freud saw it in individual terms with the patients whom he analyzed. And by the way, as I say, I probably spent as much time and energy on studying Sigmund Freud's life and teachings as almost anybody. I tell you, it was for a convinced Jungian, to have to study that much Freud was a torture. And the thing is, I am convinced on the basis of that Freud was very honest. And some of these accusations that have been voiced against him of having camouflaged and concealed different things in the past, that's all nonsense. He was brutally honest. In any event, the early 20th century, let's say, or most of the 20th century, was the age of depth psychology. And there, of course, repression plays a big role. So between 1916 and 1928, Lawrence's works take on an increasingly sort of prophetic keynote and a prophetic urgency. And you can, when you read the books, of course, you know, fictional books, but you catch that what he is saying is, if these issues in society and in the Western culture are not faced and not resolved, if the repressions are not done away with and so forth, then we are going to be in very big trouble. That's what I mean by prophetic. Among these books are Women in Love, Aaron's Rod, Kangaroo, The Lady Bird, which was not written about President Johnson's wife. It's supposed to be funny, but it is okay. The Lady Bird, England, My England, Saint Maur, and a really weird, controversial one, The Plumed Serpent. They are increasingly prophetic, increasingly under the influence of his demon, striving most powerfully to impress the reader with the need for a unitary development. So really, if we strip the the language from its excesses and things like that. What he is advocating in his own way is same that Jung advocated as individuation, a unification of the human without repression, without evasion and things of that sort. So he's trying to powerfully impress the reader with the need for that unitary development, a union of the opposites. Whether these opposites appear as intellect and feeling, civilization and nature, mind and body, conscious and unconscious, these are the opposites. So 1921 and 1922 respectively, he authored 2 long essays actually dealing with psychoanalysis. One of them, Psychoanalysis and the Unconscious, and Fantasia and the Unconscious. Lawrence was initially ambivalent toward Freud. So was practically everybody. Poor Freud, and didn't have too many friends to begin with. And then Lawrence became very critical of Freud and of all psychoanalysis. Unlike so many other writers and intellectuals of his day who sort of bowed down to Freudianism, and because it was a convenient fad, and if you worked it into your writings, then people would read your books. And so Lawrence saw the great faults of that the Freudian model of the psyche had. You know, he could see that Freud's picture of the psyche was, when it comes right down to it, inaccurate. Although it was certainly a great help to many people, I don't know whether Lawrence recognized that or not, but he was surely no Freudian. So to him, Freudian psychology meant the death of all spontaneous creative life. Now that's a pretty powerful judgment, isn't it? However, he wasn't entirely wrong about that, because Freud viewed the unconscious as the area of repression. The unconscious, to a major extent, to Freud, was anti-consciousness. Freud looked with a jaundiced eye on the unconscious because he had a pathological view of the psyche, and he said that all kinds of repressed stuff and so forth in the unconscious, when it radiates up into the conscious ego, causes trouble, causes neurosis. And therefore, if we can do away with the problems in the unconscious, well, then everybody will be sane. But what did that sanity mean to Sigmund Freud? And I think that Lawrence recognized this very, very well. It meant to him that people will be adjusted. And what that meant was that they would all adjust to society, do what society wants them to do, because the resistance against society makes for a neurotic. A neurotic is a person who is not adjusted to his environment. But you can see that Lawrence was probably very right, that if Freud would ever be so lucky as to accomplish his objective with enough people, it would be the dullest, the least creative, the most annoying kind of life in society possible. So see, we have to keep that in mind. And there again, yes, we all have to practice a certain amount of adjustment, but only a certain amount. Because otherwise we are becoming nations of sheep. And now I certainly don't want to insult my friends in New Zealand or something like that, but you know, when when you're in the midst of a tremendous number of sheep, it's strange. And we were flying around in New Zealand when I was there, because I was lecturing all over both islands, and sort of in an airplane not terribly high, and you look down, there are these huge, dirty, white patches on the ground, and they're all moving, they're all sheep. And it says, oh my God. And I said, you know, that if I lived here, I would become like that. So as soon as my engagement was over, I got on the plane and got all the people, oh, New Zealand, so wonderful, so natural, so green. First of all, I was there in the autumn, and it was wet, and it was cold, and I couldn't stay warm, you know. And then, you know, even otherwise, well, let's put it that way, New Zealand isn't my favorite place. There's some very nice people there, but if I were forced to move there, I think it would be an inducement to me for suicide. And that's it, you know. It's the adjusted mentality is the mentality of sheep. Bah, bah, bah. And so certainly we all have to practice a certain amount of adjustment. I mean, even in Hollywood, if we start walking around naked, people might demand a certain amount of adjustment from us in terms of our attire and so forth. But on the other hand, as Lawrence very properly recognized, the objective, if we want to call it that way, maybe it's very highfalutin, the objective of life is not adjustment. The objective of life is becoming yourself. And there I think he would have found a very close ally in Jung, but it seems that he didn't, you know, to him all psychoanalysts were the same thing. So what can you do? In any event, Lawrence saw the unconscious that Jung saw and that Freud had discovered. But to Freud, the unconscious was the reservoir of a repression, is malign, while to Lawrence saw a much deeper substratum of the unconscious, going back clear to the biological part of the human, and certainly also combined with a lot of feeling. So you might say that he had an inkling of what Jung called the collective unconscious. And so Lawrence recognized the great Freudian fallacy. Freud analyzed the psyche, and Lawrence said it is not enough to analyze the psyche. The psyche must not be only analyzed, it must be united. It must come together. It is not enough to know intellectually what is there. One must know it by uniting. There must be a unitive knowing. versus only analytical knowledge. And that is, I think, that's a very profound subject, but whether it's by psychoanalysis or otherwise, when we pick everything apart, we end up with a big pile of psychological trash or other kind of trash. So maybe we have to keep in mind that another and probably more important task is to put things together. And there again, it's too bad that Lawrence did not meet Jung, because they would have had a lot in common. But certainly he lived in the age of psychoanalysis, and he was struggling with that particular issue. And now another issue, if we want to call it that, let me see, oh yes, here we are. Another issue comes forth in a very powerful but also very gruesome, terrifying book of his, which is The Plumed Serpent. As one might expect, in this book he's dealing with Mexico, and that there is much emphasis on blood and slaughter in a peculiar manner. Now we all, I don't know whether we all do, but we should know that the plumed serpent is the ancient deity, Quetzalcoatl, and it's a very interesting myth. And it's one of the great myths of the Aztecs, and actually revered in other Indian nations, South American Indian nations also. But Mr. Manly Hall, for instance, in his book about America's Secret Destiny, has beautiful interpretations of the myth of the plumed serpent. But what Lawrence had done here, he used the plumed serpent as the title of the book, and what he does here is a sort of Nietzschean interpretation of what he never spent much time in Mexico, of the Mexican scene. Like so many Europeans, to him bullfights, for instance, are all wrong, because they are an alienated sport, a senseless bloodlust, etc. But then, in his book, he sort of prophetically predicts a great revolt of largely the native Indian peoples, with much bloodlust, with tremendous amount of martial engagement. And so Lawrence becomes for a while a sort of neo-pagan, envisioning the overthrow of Christianity with some relish, his romantic paganism centering on the plumed serpent Quetzalcoatl. Now, reductionistically, this is wrong, because Quetzalcoatl is a, how should I put it, and I have not made a very lengthy study of those myths, but the Quetzalcoatl myth is an addition, a new development in Aztec and other mythologies there. And the basic mythology is that of many of the old gods, and a tremendous amount of blood sacrifice, much of it of humans. So this needs to be kept in mind. Certain religions, more than others, although they all have their shadow side, contain a great deal of primitive cruelty, regression, and the regression to that kind of mythic life would be disastrous. So he sort of prefigured a little bit the modern shamanizing phenomenon in the 60s, but one must be aware of a qualitative difference between, say, primitive shamanism and a higher magic and so forth. And so here, let's say, he romanticized a tribalistic development, which I think did not deserve to be romanticized. But let us say we need to keep in mind that groupthink, tribalistic life is not a particularly good thing. Whether that groupthink is based on one's tribe, whether it is based on one's color, whether it is based on one's class, or whatever it is, groupthink is dangerous for the following reason. Because groupthink suppresses individual thought. It's another form of repression. We have a consciousness to use it. As I said, why do you think you have that head on your neck if you're not going to use it? But if we allow that to sink into a groupthink mentality, then we are in a great deal of trouble. This is precisely what occurred in Nazi Germany, also in a different way in the various communist countries, and it is to be avoided. So let's say the plumed serpent theme gives us something to think about. So after that Mexican episode, Lawrence was ready for two of his greatest works, one of which was also his most controversial, and you all know at least the title, Lady Chatterley's Lover. And another one which he wrote around that time, The Apocalypse, the latter being actually a posthumous publication published after his death, to which Lawrence could not relate himself, as he obviously was no longer alive, but he could relate himself to Lady Chatterley's Lover. So that became, of course, his most controversial book. Ironically, not primarily because of its scenes depicting sexual encounters, which were obviously there and they were explicit enough, but because of its protagonists, especially the chief figure Mellors, the gamekeeper, his proclivity to preach most vocally about sex, not infrequently using long abominated four-letter words. So it's sort of the verbal sex, I think, that bugged most people with that book. With all the sexual controversy, there is once again a most important element that is often lost sight of, and that is the prevalence of the entire theme of the book of the element of the conjunction of the opposites. That it takes two to tango, whatever tango may mean in this connection. In addition, there are other elements. In the people themselves, especially in Mr. Mellow's, low origins but high-mindedness, dirty talk combined with purity of soul, and above all an ability to draw on the full force of the titanic strength that dwells in the psyche, and which, interestingly enough, he characterizes often with tenderness. So that, let's say, when sexuality is combined with tenderness, then you have a little bit of a different situation here. Here is what Lawrence himself called phallic consciousness, but combined with the tenderness and the gentleness that breaks down the barriers of distrust, of fear, of hypocrisy, and of social convention. So the chief protagonist, Mellows, the gamekeeper, is the biologically and psychologically aware person who preaches the value and who wins a convert to his cause from a different class, a different sex, a different belief, but who is won over by the power that is itself a union of the opposites of earth and heaven, of the force of instinct and the balm of tenderness, of the best that biology and psychology of the human being can offer. So there are complex psychological and maybe even psycho-spiritual themes in Lady Chatterley's Lover. If you pardon me for a minute. Now, of course, it would be, excuse me, it would be highly interesting, but I am not the one to undertake it for sure, to do some literary criticism in depth of the message of Lady Chatterley's Lover, and contrast it with what is going on in psychosexual terms in the culture right now. For one thing, the importance, and this is an archetypal importance of the masculine and the feminine, is being not only minimized, but is being repressed. And now, you know, well, there are not just two sexes, there are myriad sexes, and all this sort of thing, and the changing of sex and all of that. You know, this would not sit very well with D.H. Lawrence, because the opposites that are to relate to each other, that are to unite, are now very much obscured. They are sinking into a swamp, and it will be interesting to see whether that situation will ever clarify itself again, because undoubtedly there have always been crossovers, there have always been anomalies, all that sort of thing. Go back to ancient Greece, go back to ancient Rome, in all kinds of places. But somehow the duality of the two, the masculine and the feminine, which are trying to relate to each other, is of very great importance. And if that is somehow swallowed up by the culture, I don't think that the results are going to be very commendable. And I'm sure that D.H. Lawrence would be terrified. So I think the Lady Chatterley's lover may need to be looked at again. So Lawrence was aware of the complexity, let us say, of this situation. And let's say since then, I think, in Jungian psychology and others, and I'll just go through this quickly, there has been, I think, some very reputable insight into the stages of psychosexual development, the development of the sexual instinct. The number one is what the old Greeks would call hyletic or unconscious sexuality, identification with the demon of sexuality. The person is concerned only, or at least primarily, with his or her libidinal needs. That's the physical. Then when we come to the psyche, we have the emotional form of sexuality. Emotion of love arises. The entire person or the entire body becomes a symbol of the emotion. Feeling is here, but it is not primarily personal. There is a great projection, but still, let's say, the recognition of the person may not be there. Then the third is the personalized form of sexuality. Emotion now demands personality. Persons write or receive love poems, not just bodies, not just emotional bundles, but persons. Tenderness, cherishing of personhood, and these are very important developments of the psyche. And the fourth, where we might say the superpersonal phase of development, where the force or the energy of the archetypal nature is activated, and when the personal develops into a communion with superpersonal forces, the symbols of which are the god and the goddess, union of the opposites. And this phase is not sufficiently common yet, but it is of great importance. Now, it is my feeling, and at one time I read a lot of T.H. Lawrence. It is my feeling that with his intuitive demon, he was striving towards some of these recognitions, and that he has arrived indeed very, very commendably at some. What perhaps would be the difficulty now, if he were here, as to how he could relate these insights, which ultimately are very profound and very important, to the weirdness that is going on in the culture. I don't think he would be happy. And moreover, perhaps there would be good reason for his unhappiness. But we are definitely dealing with an area of energy here, an alchemy, which has always been known and has been dealt with in various ways, and which still is in need of closer observation and understanding. So I think that he still has a very great deal to say to us and to the culture, and that we are really faced with a person of and a writer and a thinker of very great, profound insight and profound knowledge, and we should be grateful for that. And perhaps we should since he wrote so much, there still should be some of his books around in libraries and places, and the reading and the comprehension of which would benefit us. And so let's be grateful to this great and creative and indeed in many ways profoundly insightful figure of our culture, and hope for more like him. So thank you very much, and we'll look at the ladies next time.